Hi everyone, welcome to the special Shark Week edition of the Marine Guardians podcast. I am Janine, your host, and today we will be discussing a topic brought up in a recent letter to the editor regarding the recent CITES listing, including more species of sharks. And with us today, we have two very special guests, Lynn, our shark fin expert, and Golam, our shark meat expert. So, Golam, would you like to introduce to us how the shark trade works?
So the shark trade is a huge industry around the world. It's almost $1 billion $1 billion of value. So the shark trade sort of constitutes mainly of shark fins, shark meat, and various other products such as like oil or fats that can be obtained from like bladders, etc. And basically, different parts of the shark can be sold in different ways, and this sort of makes up the shark trade. And the problem is that the trade is sort of overexploiting the various stocks of shark populations that we have around the world. Therefore, this has called for various ways to regulate it. So my focus is currently on the shark meat trade, which slightly differs from the shark fin trade. The markets for them are different because different sort of countries have different demands for the two products.
So often when we talk about shark conservation, we think about like finning, but maybe Lynn can talk more about that.
Yes. So shark finning, right, is the process of cutting off just the fins from the shark fin that has either intentionally been caught or caught as bycatch. And often the meat part is either discarded or then sold as part of the shark meat trade. But the focus here is really on the fin, which means that it is often disregarded where species are being caught, and sharks are keystone species in their ecosystem, right? They're regulating a lot of the food chains and how the ecosystems function. So the removal of sharks can cause the collapse of a lot of marine ecosystems that even our fisheries depend on, right? So that's why a lot of regulations for the shark fin trade came into place.
Okay, the recent letter to the editor was talks about CITES and how they help with shark conservation. Maybe Lynn can talk about that too. Introduce CITES.
Yeah, so CITES is the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species. So they are trying to create guidelines, often in collaboration, for example, with the UN, which species are endangered, and they have different appendices where they list the level of endangerment of these species. For example, the Appendix 2 lists species that would be critically endangered if their trade is not regulated.
The different appendices also, the way that appendices work is Appendix 1 is sort of the most controlled species, 2 is slightly less than that, and 3 is even less. Appendix 1 and 2 both just say that when a species is being traded, there needs to be trade permits that sort of say the species is not being, the trade of the species is not harming its population, and the listing just differs based on how many permits and how strict the permitting is. Yeah.
So these guidelines can then be used by authorities to check if countries that sign the CITES agreement are really adhering to limiting those trades.
Okay, so the article we were talking about talks about how there are now a lot more shark species being listed under the CITES. So how do you guys think that it will affect the shark meat and the shark fin trade?
Initially, how this would affect both sort of trades is sort of similar in that now there's more species that if they're found in the various products that are being traded, then their trade can be sort of restricted or like permits can be asked for. So the change has been there's been around 54 species that has been added to Appendix 2, and this change sort of includes species that now covers 70% of the whole sort of that $1 billion industry from around 25% from before this last conference. The way this helps is that now enforcement authorities have more power to sort of like check for various species because there's just a higher chance of finding CITES listed species in the various products, and so the argument is that it sort of makes it easier for that trade. But I have some thoughts that maybe it might not be that effective. But Lynn, do you have anything to add?
So I emphatically agree with you that it is not very helpful in limiting the shark fin trade necessarily, because dried shark fins are very difficult to differentiate visually. So after the shark fin has been dried through, like, for example, salt processing, you cannot separate where the species came from. You can do that through a DNA analysis. We actually found a lot of endangered species, for example, in Singapore also, but that is impossible in the field. So even though there are more species on the listing now, it doesn't necessarily mean that more of them can be identified from just looking at the traded fins.
So what about the shark meat industry?
So for the shark meats, it's a similar situation where usually the products that is like found in the market is like cubes of like chopped up shark meat that's like dried and salted. If you look at the different products, like both different species just like all look the same, and without like doing DNA analysis, it's very hard to sort of identify that, and that sort of raises the problem that when products are coming in, the only way to understand them is you are also destroying the product itself when you're doing the testing. So it's very difficult to test every single thing that's coming in.
So other than enforcement, how do you think that this change in regulations would affect other aspects of like the shark trade?
So what CITES is trying to do is help stop the regulation at the trade ports. But another way to sort of address this is instantly when sharks are being brought in from like ships and boats, you can like check for the species there. But the problem that lies there is there's a lot of illegal trade present where so the term to describe these fisheries are IUU fisheries. IUU stands for illegal, unregulated, and unreported fisheries. And what this just means is that whatever catch they have is not being reported or checked by any authorities at shipping ports. So this sort of creates this other side of the industry that not a lot of people know about, or there's like no way to sort of regulate it if there's no enforcement already present in the first place. So that's one of the difficulties of sort of controlling sharks.
A second problem is also the bycatch, right? Even though these regulations are in place, if fins have just been cut off and the bodies are not even brought into the harbor, it becomes very difficult to identify the species.
Since you guys studied sharks in like the Singapore context, how do you think where is Singapore in like the shark trade and
So Singapore is actually worldwide the second largest shark fin inland exporter. We're talking about 2,500 tons of shark fins every year that are being imported and exported. This is mainly because shark fins are seen as a delicacy, so they're part of often shark fin soups or dishes that are served at celebratory events, and they also have a long history in traditional Chinese medicine. So these are also cultural aspects that need to be considered and why the trade is still so prevalent in Singapore.
For the meat trade, there are various other dishes, etc., that are made from the meat and not sort of the fin side of it. And such products, there's like Indian dishes that uses shark meat. Shark meat is also like a cheap fish substitute. In some like maybe shops or restaurants, shark meat is sort of used as a substitute to replace like fish in fish balls, etc. And that's where the demand for shark meat comes from.
So is there any like illegal shark trade happening in Singapore?
So that is difficult to differentiate, right? Because some shark fins are still legal to be traded. These are less endangered species. But again, as they are so difficult to differentiate once you have a shark fin in a store, this is unfortunately still happening. So studies in Singapore have found that more than 2/3 actually of the shark fins that are traded in Singapore are endangered, so they're listed on the IUCN Red List as threatened species.
Although the CITES regulation might be a big step towards shark conservation, our experts have expressed their doubts. How else do you think we can help regulate this trade and help with shark conservation?
Personally, I feel like, as I mentioned, the CITES regulations sort of try to address the shark trade after it has been caught and it is already being introduced into the market. It is just preventing the trade from expanding to different countries. And the problem with that is, as I mentioned, there are sort of illegal markets available, and so if fishermen's main primary source of income is sharks, they don't have any other industry to sort of shift to, and they will sort of resort to these illegal markets. So I think there's more community level work that can be done to sort of help with the trade of sharks. One example is Dorsal Effect, which is a company that's Singapore-based but working in Indonesia to work with fishermen to understand their livelihoods and sort of provide them with more community-specific solutions. So, for example, in some places they're trying to help these fishermen switch to ecotourism, and this just gives them another source of income and sort of helps them move away from shark fishing.
There's also a lot of technological improvement that's happening. So just last year, Conservation International actually launched an app which is called FinFinder, which tries to train AI to identify shark fins. So the more data we have on the actual DNA sequence and species identification of a dried fin, we can train via cameras and pictures, can train AI to identify potentially endangered species from the dried fins. Of course, this always has to be checked in the lab, but it is one tool that has some promising results so far.
So, but what do you all think about like more commercial, like big scale fishing? Do you think there's a way to avoid bycatch in those areas?
So there are sort of technological solutions to this. I am not aware of anything specific to sharks, but there has been ways to free dolphins or turtles from large fishing nets. So you can design the fishing nets in such a way that there's sort of an escape hatch which larger animals can sort of pass through and out of the net, while other sort of the target fishes can instead be caught. So that's maybe one solution that these commercial fishing fleets can consider to reduce their bycatch.
Okay, so there is hope. Thank you for watching our podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yay!
Yay!